All right, tonight's story from Neil Gaiman's Smoke and Mirrors will be the first part of The Goldfish Pool and Other Stories. It was raining when I arrived in LA, and I felt myself surrounded by 100 old movies. There was a limo driver in a black uniform waiting for me at the airport, holding a white sheet of cardboard with my name misspelled neatly upon it. "I'm taking you straight to your hotel, sir," said the driver. He seemed vaguely disappointed that I didn't have any real luggage for him to carry, just a battered overnight bag stuffed with t-shirts, underwear, and socks. "Is it far?" He shook his head. "Maybe 25, 30 minutes. You ever been to LA before?" "No." "Well, what I always say, LA is a 30-minute town. Wherever you want to go, it's 30 minutes away, no more." He hauled my bag into the boot of the car, which he called the trunk, and opened the door for me to climb into the back. "So, where are you from?" he asked as we headed out of the airport into the slick, wet, neon-spattered streets. "England." "England, eh?" "Yes. Have you ever been there?" "No, sir. I've seen movies. You an actor?" "I'm a writer." He lost interest. Occasionally, he would swear at other drivers under his breath. He swerved, suddenly changing lanes. We passed a 4-car pileup in the lane we had been in. "You get a little rain in this city, all of a sudden, everybody forgets how to drive," he told me. I burrowed further into the cushions in the back. "You get rain in England, I hear." It was a statement, not a question. "A little." "More than a little. Rains every day in England," he laughed. "And thick fog. Real thick, thick fog." "Not really." "What do you mean, no?" he asked, puzzled, defensive. "I've seen movies." We sat in silence then, driving through the Hollywood rain, but after a while he said, "Ask them for the room Belushi died in." "Pardon?" "Belushi, John Belushi. It was your hotel he died in. Drugs. You heard about that?" "Oh, yes." "They made a movie about his death. Some fat guy didn't look nothing like him. But nobody tells the real truth about his death. You see, he wasn't alone. There were 2 other guys with him. Studios didn't want any shit. But you're a limo driver. You hear things." "Really?" "Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. They were there with him. All of them going dodo on the happy dust." The hotel building was a white mock Gothic chateau. I said goodbye to the chauffeur and checked in. I did not ask about the room in which Belushi had died. I walked out to my chalet through the rain, my overnight bag in my hand, clutching the set of keys that would, the desk clerk told me, get me through the various doors and gates. The air smelled of wet dust and, curiously enough, cough mixture. It was dusk, almost dark. Water splashed everywhere. It ran in rills and rivulets across the courtyard. It ran into a small fish pond that jutted out from the side of a wall in the courtyard. I walked up the stairs and into a dank little room. It seemed a poor kind of a place for a star to die. The bed seemed slightly damp, and the rain drummed a maddening beat on the air conditioning system. I watched a little television, the rerun wasteland. Cheers segged imperceptibly into Taxi, which flickered into black and white and became I Love Lucy, then stumbled into sleep. I dreamed of drummers intermittently drumming only 30 minutes away. The phone woke me. "Hey, hey, hey! You made it okay then." "Who is this?" "It's Jacob at the studio. Are we still on for breakfast? Hey, hey!" "Breakfast?" "No problem. I'll pick you up at your hotel in 30 minutes. Reservations are already made. No problems. You got my messages? I faxed them through last night. See ya. The rain had stopped. The sunshine was warm and bright, proper Hollywood light. I walked up to the main building, walking on a carpet of crushed eucalyptus leaves, the cough medicine smell from the night before. They handed me an envelope with a fax in it, my schedule for the next few days, with messages of encouragement and faxed handwritten doodles in the margin saying things like, "This is going to be a blockbuster," and "Is this going to be a great movie or what?" The fax was signed by Jacob Klein, obviously the voice on the phone. I had never before had any dealings with a Jacob Klein. A small red sports car drew up outside the hotel. The driver got out and waved at me. I walked over. He had a trim pepper and salt beard, a smile that was almost bankable, and a gold chain around his neck. He showed me a copy of Sons of Man. He was Jacob. We shook hands. "Is David around?" "David Gamble." David Gamble was the man I'd spoken to earlier on the phone when arranging the trip. He wasn't the producer. I wasn't quite certain what he was. He described himself as attached to the project. "David's not with the studio anymore. I'm kind of running the project now. And I want you to know I'm really psyched. Hey, hey!" "That's good." We got in the car. "Where's the meeting?" I asked. He shook his head. "It's not a meeting," he said. "It's a breakfast." I looked puzzled. He took pity on me. "A kind of pre-meeting meeting," he explained. We drove from the hotel to a mall somewhere half an hour away, while Jacob told me how much he enjoyed my book and how delighted he was that he'd become attached to the project. He said it was his idea to have me put up in the hotel. "Give you the kind of Hollywood experience you'd never get at the Four Seasons or Mason, right?" And asked me if I was staying in the chalet in which John Belushi had died. I told him I didn't know, but that I rather doubted it. "You know who he was with when he died? They covered it up, the studios." "No. Who?" "Meryl and Dustin." "This is Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman we're talking about?" "Sure." "How do you know this?" "People talk. It's Hollywood, you know?" I nodded, as if I did know, but I didn't. People talk about books that write themselves, and it's a lie. Books don't write themselves. It takes thought and research and backache and notes and more time and more work than you'd believe, except for Sons of Man, and that one pretty much wrote itself. The irritating question they ask us being writers, is, where do you get your ideas? And the answer is confluence. Things come together, the right ingredients, and suddenly, abracadabra. It began with a documentary on Charles Manson I was watching more or less by accident. It was on a videotape a friend lent me after a couple of things I did want to watch. There was footage of Manson back when he was first arrested, when people thought he was innocent and that it was the government picking on the hippies. And up on the screen was Manson, a charismatic, good-looking, messianic orator. Someone you'd crawl barefoot into hell for. Someone you could kill for. The trial started, and a few weeks into it, the orator was gone, replaced by a shambling, ape-like gibberer with a cross carved into its forehead. Whatever the genius was no longer there. It was gone, but it had been there. The documentary continued. A hard-eyed ex-con who had been in prison with Manson explaining, "Charlie Manson? Listen, Charlie was a joke. He was a nothing. We laughed at him, you know? He was a nothing." And I nodded. There was a time before Manson was the charisma king then. I thought of a benediction, something given that was taken away. I watched the rest of the documentary obsessively. Then, over a black and white still, the narrator said something. I rewound, and he said it again. I had an idea. I had a book that wrote itself. The thing the narrator had said was this, that the infant children Manson had fathered on the women of the family were sent to a variety of children's homes for adoption, with court-given surnames that were certainly not Manson. And I thought of a dozen 25-year-old Mansons, thought of the charisma thing descending on all of them at the same time. 12 young Mansons in their glory, gradually being pulled toward LA from all over the world, and a Manson daughter trying desperately to stop them from coming together, and, as the back cover blurb told us, realizing their terrifying destiny. I wrote Sons of Man at white heat. It was finished in a month, and I sent it to my agent, who was surprised by it. Well, it's not like your other stuff, dear, she said, helpfully, and she sold it after an auction, my first, for more money than I had thought possible. My other books, 3 collections of elegant, elusive, and elusive ghost stories, had scarcely paid for the computer on which they were written. And then it was bought, pre-publication, by Hollywood, again after an auction. There were 3 or 4 studios interested. I went with the studio who wanted me to write the script. I knew it would never happen, knew they'd never come through. But then the faxes began to spew out of my machine late at night, most of them enthusiastically signed by one Dave Gamble. One morning, I signed 5 copies of a contract thick as a brick. A few weeks later, my agent reported the first check had cleared and tickets to Hollywood had arrived for preliminary talks. It seemed like a dream. The tickets were business class. It was the moment I saw the tickets were business class that I knew the dream was real. I went to Hollywood in the bubble bit at the top of the jumbo jet, nibbling smoked salmon and holding a hot-off-the-press hardback of Sons of Man. So, breakfast. They told me how much they loved the book. I didn't quite catch anybody's name. The men had beards or baseball caps or both. The women were astoundingly attractive in a sanitary sort of way. Jacob ordered our breakfast and paid for it. He explained that the meeting coming up was a formality. It's your book we love, he said. Why would we have bought your book if we didn't want to make it? Why would we have hired you to write it if we didn't want the specialness you'd bring to the project, the you-ness? I nodded very seriously, as if literary meanness was something I had spent many hours pondering. An idea like this, a book like this, you're pretty unique. One of the uniquest, said a woman named Dinah or Tina or possibly Deanna. I raised an eyebrow. So, what am I meant to do at the meeting? Be receptive, said Jacob. Be positive. The drive to the studio took about half an hour in Jacob's little red car. We drove up to the security gate where Jacob had an argument with the guard. I gathered that he was new at the studio and had not yet been issued a permanent studio pass. Nor, it appeared, once we got inside, did he have a permanent parking place. I still do not understand the ramifications of this. From what he said, parking places had as much to do with status at the studio as gifts from the emperor determine one's status in the court of ancient China. We drove through the streets of an oddly flat New York and parked in front of a huge old bank. 10 minutes walk, and I was in a conference room with Jacob and all the people from breakfast waiting for someone to come in. In the flurry, I'd rather missed who the someone was and what he or she did. I took out my copy of my book and put it in front of me, a talisman of sorts. Someone came in. He was tall, with a pointy nose and a pointy chin, and his hair was too long. He looked like he'd kidnapped someone much younger and stolen their hair. He was an Australian, which surprised me. He sat down. He looked at me. "Shoot," he said. I looked at the people from the breakfast, but none of them were looking at me. I couldn't catch anyone's eye, so I began to talk about the book, about the plot, about the end, the showdown in LA, the showdown in the LA nightclub, where the good Manson girl blows the rest of them up, or thinks she does, about my idea for having one actor play all the Manson boys. "Do you believe this stuff?" It was the first question from the someone. That one was easy. It was one I'd already answered for at least 24 British journalists. "Do I believe that a supernatural power possessed Charles Manson for a while, and is even now possessing his many children? No. Do I believe that something strange was happening? I suppose I must do. Perhaps it was simply that, for a brief while, his madness was in step with the madness of the world outside. I don't know. This Manson kid, he could be Keanu Reeves?" "God, no," I thought. Jacob caught my eye and nodded desperately. "I don't see why not," I said. It was all imagination anyway. None of it was real. "We're cutting a deal with his people," said the someone, nodding thoughtfully. "They sent me off to do a treatment for them to approve, and by them I understood they meant the Australian someone, although I was not entirely sure. Before I left, someone gave me $700 and made me sign for it. 2 weeks per diem. I spent 2 days doing the treatment. I kept trying to forget the book and structure the story as a film. The work went well. I sat in the little room and typed on a notebook computer the studio had sent down for me, and printed out 4 pages on the bubble jet printer the studio sent down with it. I ate in my room. Each afternoon, I would go for a short walk down Sunset Boulevard. I would walk as far as the almost all-night bookstore, where I would buy a newspaper. Then I would sit outside in the hotel courtyard for half an hour reading the newspaper. And then, having had my ration of sun and air, I would go back into the dark and turn my book back into something else. There was a very old black man, a hotel employee, who would walk across the courtyard each day with almost painful slowness and water the plants and inspect the fish. He'd grin at me as he went past, and I'd nod at him. On the 3rd day, I got up and walked over to him as he stood by the fish pool, picking out bits of rubbish by hand, a couple of coins, and a cigarette packet. "Hello," I said. "Sir?" said the old man. I thought about asking him not to call me sir, but I couldn't think of a way to put it that might not cause offense. "Nice fish." He nodded and grinned. "Ornamental carp, brought here all the way from China." We watched them swim around the little pool. "I wonder if they get bored." He shook his head. "My grandson, he's an ichthyologist. You know what that is?" "Studies fishes." "Uh-huh. He says they only got a memory that's like 30 seconds long. So they swim around the pool. It's always a surprise to them. Going, 'I never been here before.' They meet another fish they'd known for 100 years. They say, 'Who are you, stranger?'" Will you ask your grandson something for me?" The old man nodded. "I read once that carp don't have set lifespans. They don't age like we do. They die if they're killed by people or predators or disease, but they don't just get old and die. Theoretically, they could live forever." He nodded. "I'll ask him. It sure sounds good. These 3, now this one, I call him Ghost. He's only 4, 5 years old. But the other 2, they came here from China back when I was first here. And when was that? That would have been in the year of our Lord, 1924. How old do I look to you? I couldn't tell. He might have been carved from old wood, over 50 and younger than Methuselah. I told him so. I was born in 1906. God's truth. Were you born here in L.A.? He shook his head. When I was born, Los Angeles wasn't nothing but an orange grove, a long way from New York. He sprinkled fish food on the surface of the water. The 3 fish bobbed up, pale white silvered ghost carp, staring at us, or seeming to, the O's of their mouths continually opening and closing, as if they were talking to us in some silent, secret language of their own. I pointed to the one he had indicated. So, he's Ghost, yes? He's Ghost. That's right. That one under the lily, you can see his tail there, see? He's called Buster, after Buster Keaton. Keaton was staying here when we got the older 2, and this one's our Princess. Princess was the most recognizable of the white carp. She was a pale cream color, with a blotch of vivid crimson along her back, setting her apart from the other 2. She's lovely. She surely is. She surely is all of that. He took a deep breath then and began to cough, a wheezing cough that shook his thin frame. I was able then, for the first time, to see him as a man of 90. Are you all right? He nodded. Fine, fine, fine. Old bones, he said. Old bones. We shook hands, and I returned to my treatment and the gloom. I printed out the completed treatment, faxed it off to Jacob at the studio. The next day, he came over to the chalet. He looked upset. Everything okay? Is there a problem with the treatment? Just shit going down. We made this movie with, and he named a well-known actress who had been in a few successful films a couple of years before. Can't lose, huh? Only she's not as young as she was, and she insists on doing her own nude scenes. And that's not a body anybody wants to see, believe me. So the plot is, there's this photographer who is persuading women to take their clothes off for him. Then he stuffs them. Only no one believes he's doing it, so the chief of police, played by Mrs. Let Me Show You the World My Naked Butt, realizes that the only way she can arrest him is if she pretends to be one of the women, so she sleeps with him. Now, there's a twist. She falls in love with him? Oh, yeah. And then she realizes that women will always be imprisoned by male images of women, and to prove her love for him, when the police come to arrest the 2 of them, she sets fire to all the photographs and dies in the fire. Her clothes burn off first. How does that sound to you? Dumb. That was what we thought when we saw it. So we fired the director and recut it and did an extra day's shoot. Now she's wearing a wire when they make out. And when she starts to fall in love with him, she finds out that he killed her brother. She has a dream in which her clothes burn off. Then she goes out with the SWAT team to try to bring him in. But he gets shot by her little sister, who he's also been shupping. Is it any better? He shakes his head. It's junk. If she let us use a stand-in for the nude sequences, maybe we'd be in better shape. What did you think of the treatment? What? My treatment. The one I sent you. Sure, that treatment. We loved it. We all loved it. It was great. Really terrific. We're all really excited. So, what's next? Well, as soon as everyone's had a chance to look it over, we'll get together and talk about it. He patted me on the back and went away, leaving me with nothing to do in Hollywood. I decided to write a short story. There was an idea I'd had in England before I'd left, something about a small theater at the end of a pier. Stage magic is the rain came down. An audience who couldn't tell the difference between magic and illusion, and to whom it would make no difference if every illusion was real. That afternoon, on my walk, I bought a couple of books on stage magic and Victorian illusions in the almost all-night bookshop. A story, or the seed of it anyways, was there in my head, and I wanted to explore it. I sat on the bench in the courtyard and browsed through the books. There was, I decided, a specific atmosphere that I was after. I was reading about the pocketsmen who had pockets filled with every small object you could imagine and would produce whatever you asked on request. No illusion, just remarkable feats of organization and memory. A shadow fell across the page. I looked up. "Hello again," I said to the old black man. "Sir," he said. "Please, don't call me that. It makes me feel like I ought to be wearing a suit or something." I told him my name. He told me his. "Pius Dundas." Pius? I wasn't sure that I'd heard him correctly. He nodded proudly. "Sometimes I am, and sometimes I ain't. It's what my mama called me, and it's a good name." "Yes. So, what are you doing here, sir?" "I'm not sure. I meant to be writing a film, I think. Or at least I'm waiting for them to tell me to start writing a film." He scratched his nose. "All the film people stayed here. If I started to tell you them all now, I could talk till a week next Wednesday, and I wouldn't have told you the half of them." "Who are your favorites?" "Harry Langdon. He was a gentleman. George Sanders. He was English like you. He'd say, 'Ah, Pius, you must pray for my soul.' And I'd say, 'Your soul's your own affair, Mr. Sanders.' But I prayed for him just the same. And June Lincoln." "June Lincoln?" His eyes sparkled and he smiled. "She was the queen of the silver screen. She was finer than any of them. Mary Pickford or Lillian Gish or Theda Bara or Louise Brooks. She was the finest. She had it. You know what it was? Sex appeal? More than that. She was everything you ever dreamed of. You'd see a June Lincoln picture, you wanted to." He broke off, waved one hand in small circles as if he were trying to catch the missing words. "I don't know. Go down on one knee, maybe, like a knight in shining armor to the Queen. June Lincoln. She was the best of them. I told my grandson about her. He tried to find something for the VCR, but no go. Nothing out there anymore. She only lives in the heads of old men like me." He tapped his forehead. "She must have been quite something." He nodded. "What happened to her?" "She hung herself. Some folks said it was because she wouldn't have been able to cut the mustard in the talkies, but that ain't true. She had a voice you'd remember if you heard it just once. Smooth and dark, her voice was, like an Irish coffee. Some say she got her heart broken by a man, or by a woman, or that it was gambling, or gangsters, or booze. Who knows? They were wild days." "I take it that you must have heard her talk." He grinned. "She said, 'Boy, can you find what they did with my rap?' And when I come back with it, then she said, 'You're a fine one, boy.' And the man who was with her said, 'June, don't tease the help.' And she smiled at me and gave me $5 and said, 'He don't mind, do you, boy?' And I just shook my head. Then she made the thing with her lips, you know." Moo?" "Something like that. I felt it. Here." He tapped his chest. "Those lips, they could take a man apart." He bit his lower lip for a moment and focused on forever. I wondered where he was and when. Then he looked at me once more. "You want to see her lips?" "How do you mean?" "You come over here. Follow me." "What are we?" I had visions of a lip print in cement, like the handprints outside Grauman's Chinese theater. He shook his head and raised an old finger to his mouth. Silence. I closed the books. We walked across the courtyard. When he reached the little fish pool, he stopped. Look at the princess, he told me. The one with the red splotch, yes? He nodded. The fish reminded me of a Chinese dragon, wise and pale, a ghost fish, white as old bone, save for the blotch of scarlet on its back, an inch-long double bow shape. It hung in the pool, drifting, thinking. That's it, he said. On her back, see? I don't quite follow you. He paused and stared at the fish. Would you like to sit down? I found myself very conscious of Mr. Dundas's age. They don't pay me to sit down, he said, very seriously. Then he said, as if he were explaining something to his small child, it was like there were gods in those days. Today, it's all television, small heroes, little people in the boxes. I see some of them here, little people, the stars of the old times. There was giants, painted in silver light, big as houses. And when you met them, they were still huge. People believed in them. They'd have parties here. You worked here, you saw what went on. There was liquor and weed and going on you'd hardly credit. There was this one party. The film was called Hearts of the Desert. You ever heard of it? I shook my head. One of the biggest movies of 1926, up there with What Price Glory with Victor McLaglen and Dolores Del Rio and Ella Cindas, starring Colleen Moore. You heard of them? I shook my head again. You ever heard of Warner Baxter, Belle Bennett? Who were they? Big stars in 1926. He paused for a moment. Hearts of the Desert. They had a party for it here in the hotel when it wrapped. There was wine and beer and whiskey and gin. This was Prohibition days, but the studios kind of owned the police force, so they looked the other way, and there was food and a deal of foolishness. Ronald Colman was there, and Douglas Fairbanks, the father, not the son, and all the cast and the crew, and a jazz band played over there where those chalets are now. And June Lincoln was the toast of Hollywood that night. She was the Arab princess in the film. Those days, Arabs meant passion and lust. These days, well, things change. I don't know what started it all. I heard it was a dare or a bet. Maybe she was just drunk. I thought she was drunk. Anyhow, she got up and the band was playing soft and slow. And she walked over here where I'm standing right now. And she plunged her hands right into this pool. She was laughing and laughing and laughing. Miss Lincoln picked up the fish, reached in and took it up. Both hands she took it in, and she picked it up from the water, and then she held it in front of her face. Now, I was worried, because they just bought these fish in from China, and they cost $200 a piece. That was before I was looking after the fish, of course. Wasn't me that'd lose it from my wages, but still, $200 was a whole lot of money those days. Then she smiled at all of us, and she leaned down and she kissed it, slow like, on its back. It didn't wriggle or nothing. It just lay in her hand, and she kissed it with her lips like red coral. And the people at the party laughed and cheered. She put the fish back in the pool, and for a moment it was as if it didn't want to leave her. It stayed by her, nuzzling her fingers, and then the first of the fireworks went off, and it swam away. Her lipstick was red as red as red, and she left the shape of her lips on the fish's back. There, do you see? Princess, the white carp with the coral red mark on her back, flicked a fin and continued on her eternal series of 30-second journeys around the pool. The red mark did look like a lip print. He sprinkled a handful of fish food on the water, and the 3 fish bobbed and gulped to the surface. I walked back into my chalet, carrying my books on old illusions. The phone was ringing. It was someone from the studio. They wanted to talk about the treatment. A car would be there for me in 30 minutes. Will Jacob be there? But the line was already dead. The meeting was with the Australian someone and his assistant, a bespectacled man in a suit. He was the first suit I'd seen so far, and his spectacles were a vivid blue. He seemed nervous. "Where are you staying?" asked the someone. I told him. "Isn't that where Belushi?" "So I've been told." He nodded. "He wasn't alone when he died." "No?" He rubbed one finger along the side of his pointy nose. "There were a couple of other people at the party. They were both directors, both as big as you could get at that point. You don't need names. I found out about it when I was making the last Indiana Jones film." An uneasy silence. We were at a huge round table, just the 3 of us, and we each had a copy of the treatment I had written in front of us. Finally, I said, "What did you think of it?" They both nodded, more or less in unison, and then they tried, as hard as they could, to tell me they hated it while never saying anything that might conceivably upset me. It was a very odd conversation. "We have a problem with the 3rd act," they'd say, implying vaguely that the fault lay neither with me nor with the treatment, nor even with the 3rd act, but with them. They wanted the people to be more sympathetic. They wanted sharp lights and shadows, not shades of gray. They wanted the heroine to be a hero, and I nodded and took notes. At the end of the meeting, I shook hands with the someone, and the assistant in the blue-rimmed spectacles took me off through the corridor maze to find the outside world and my car and my driver. As we walked, I asked if the studio had a picture anywhere of June Lincoln. "Who?" His name, it turned out, was Greg. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down in it with a pencil. "She was a silent screen star, famous in 1926. "Was she with the studio?" "I have no idea," I admitted, "but she was famous, even more famous than Mary Provost." "Who?" A winner who became a doggy's dinner. One of the biggest stars of the silent screen. Died in poverty when the talkies came in and was eaten by her dachshund. Nick Lowe wrote a song about her." "Who?" "I knew the bride when she used to rock and roll. Anyway, June Lincoln. Can someone find me a photo?" He wrote something more down on his pad, stared at it for a moment, then wrote down something else. Then he nodded. We had reached the daylight, and my car was waiting. "By the way," he said, "you should know that he's full of shit." "I'm sorry?" "Full of shit. It wasn't Spielberg or Lucas who were with Belushi. It was Bette Midler and Linda Ronstadt. It was a coke orgy. Everybody knows that. He's full of shit. And he was just a junior studio accountant, for Christ's sakes, on the Indiana Jones movie. Like it was his movie. Asshole." We shook hands. I got in the car and went back to the hotel. The time difference caught up with me that night, and I woke utterly and irrevocably at 4 a.m. I got up, peed, then I pulled on a pair of jeans, I sleep in a t-shirt, and walked outside. I wanted to see the stars, but the lights of the city were too bright, the air too dirty. The sky was a dirty, starless yellow, and I thought of all the constellations I could see from the English countryside. and I felt for the first time deeply, stupidly homesick. I missed the stars. I wanted to work on the short story or to get on with a film script. Instead, I worked on a second draft of the treatment. I took the number of junior Mansons down to 5 from 12 and made it clear from the start that one of them, who was now male, wasn't a bad guy and the other 4 most definitely were. They sent over a copy of a film magazine. It had the smell of old pulp paper about it, and it was stamped in purple with the studio name and with the word Archives underneath. The cover showed John Barrymore on a boat. The article inside was about June Lincoln's death. I found it hard to read and harder still to understand. It hinted at the forbidden vices that led to her death. That much I could tell, but it was as if it were hinting in a cipher to which modern readers lacked a key. Or perhaps, on reflection, the writer of her obituary knew nothing and was hinting into the void. More interesting, at any rate more comprehensible, were the photos. A full-page, black-edged photo of a woman with huge eyes and a gentle smile, smoking a cigarette. The smoke was airbrushed in, to my way of thinking, very clumsily. Had people ever been taken in by such clumsy fakes? Another photo of her in a staged clinch with Douglas Fairbanks. A small photograph of her standing on the running board of a car, holding a couple of tiny dogs. She was, from the photographs, not a contemporary beauty. She lacked the transcendence of a Louise Brooks, the sex appeal of a Marilyn Monroe, the sluttish elegance of a Rita Hayworth. She was a 20s starlet, as dull as any other 20s starlet. I saw no mystery in her huge eyes or bobbed hair. She had perfectly made up Cupid's bow lips. I had no idea what she would have looked like if she had been alive and around today. Still, she was real. She had lived. She had been worshipped and adored by the people in the movie palaces. She had kissed the fish and walked in the grounds of my hotel 70 years before. No time in England, but an eternity in Hollywood.